Congregation is the noun of the verb congregate. A congregation is a group of people coming together for a specific purpose, in this case to worship God, to share the good news, and to live out one's Christian lives in a community. That is what a Christian congregation is. And within this congregation, this assembly of people, there are various groups that have specific tasks and which relate to one another in various ways. And each fulfilling its various roles and duties makes all work together beautifully, much as a symphony or a band, each playing its part, each with its own instrument, to make a beautiful sound together as one. Though it can break down in various ways, one can generally think of a congregation as composed of three parts, each with its specific tasks and each relating to one another for its common end. These three components are the ministers, the church leaders, and the church membership as a whole. And in this video, we'll explore church structure, the tasks of these various parts, their rights and responsibilities, and how they can relate together harmoniously as one. Let's start with church membership. A congregation is made up of the formal members of the church. Now, of course, a church is much bigger than that. It welcomes visitors and worship. It includes many volunteers from the community. It provides pastoral care and support to many folks. A given congregation interacts with many people in the wider community. However, it is the membership of the church that has deliberately accepted certain responsibilities towards the common purpose of the church, and likewise has certain rights regarding the decisions and actions of a congregation. What are these rights and responsibilities? Well, when a person is received into the church through baptism and becomes a part of the body of Christ, they make certain promises to be an active part of the congregation, to share of their abilities towards their common purpose, to glorify God, to live the Christian life to which they are called, and so forth. Similarly, when people are received as members by transfer from another congregation, they make certain promises to be an active participant in the life of the church. And correspondingly, by becoming church members, they are given certain rights. Rights to join freely in the worship and sacraments of the congregation, rights to reasonable expectation of pastoral care and guidance, availability to the general activities of the church, and, important for us here, voice and vote in the decisions of the congregation. Members have voice and vote, and so in most congregations, they get to choose. Indeed, it is they who do choose the budget for the coming year, what activities and projects to take up, whether to encumber real estate. And importantly, it is they who choose their elected leadership for the congregation, and, in most polities, whom they will call to be their minister. The basic component of a congregation is this church membership. The church is them. The church exists to support the faith lives of its members and to provide organization for them to more effectively live out their Christian life within their community. It is their time and talents that power the congregation. It is their financial gifts that support the congregation. It is their prayer and witness that enliven the congregation. And in most cases, the greatest powers of a congregation are reserved for the church membership. Now, within congregations, there may be levels or categories of membership. For churches that baptize infants, there may be a baptized membership. For those which confirm youth, there may be a confirmed membership. There may be a full voting membership. And depending on the organization of the congregation, there may be other levels of membership with varying rights and responsibilities. And ministers and churches of congregations ought to keep in mind that they have been chosen to serve, to guide and assist, to encourage, and to lead the membership for it is they who largely make up what a congregation is. The second group making up a congregation is the elected leadership. These are people chosen to lead and make decisions on its behalf. Usually elected at the beginning of a church year for set terms, these people sit on a board, a session, vestry, or consistory, all various names for a church's governing body. I'll refer to them as a board. Like membership, the board has its own qualifications, rights, and responsibilities. Typically, the board reviews regular reports of the congregation and makes decisions pertaining to the ongoing governance of the church. This includes what programs to pursue, what groups to host, whether to implement changes to worship and other activities, and to oversee the finances of the congregation. These important ongoing decisions that do not rise to the threshold of congregational approval are handled by the board. Now, boards can vary in their level of activity and involvement. In some congregations, a board can take a very active role in leading the church. This ranges to some larger churches, where a board is largely advisory, meeting infrequently and existing primarily to be a check on decisions made largely by a church's staff. Even in similarly sized congregations, the level of involvement exercised by a board can vary widely. So please consult your governing documents and ask about the customs of the church to gain a sense of the level of activity expected of the board. The bylaws should also specify how often a board meets, the number of its members, broadly the powers assigned to it, and so forth. And a church board is elected by the congregation to fulfill the will of the congregation, except in some instances where a member or members of the board may be appointed by the church's minister. And in turn, the board elects the officers of the congregation. These officers, even if going by various names, typically serve as both officers of the board and as officers of the congregation at large for the term which they are elected. Church officers at a minimum are president, treasurer, and secretary. And again, while these can vary by number and by name, the duties that they perform are common across denominations. The role of a president, also known as a chairman or chair, is to preside at the meetings of a board or congregation. They call meetings as necessary, help prepare the agendas for the meetings, and lead the meetings themselves, guiding the group in their deliberation and in their decisions. A good president will be skilled at leading such discussions, will have a good sense when to opine in the decision-making process, and will have a good general understanding of the questions at hand and of the workings of the congregation as a whole. A good president can go a long ways towards a happy and a healthy congregation, where people feel heard and sound decisions are arrived at with relative unity. Give good consideration to whom may be an effective president, and if you have a good president, thank God for that gift, for they can be a great blessing to the congregation. In addition, in churches, presidents can often fulfill formal or ceremonial functions, such as signing agreements, welcoming church members, and speaking on behalf of the congregation, and so forth. An officer closely related to the president, though not existing in every congregation, is the vice president. A vice president, when present, generally fulfills the president's responsibilities when the president is absent. A good VP is a great backup, and they're also an additional voice on an executive committee, which we'll get to in a little bit. The treasurer, another officer, supervises the finances of the congregation. They typically keep the books, making accurate record of the donations and expenditures of a congregation. They make payments on behalf of congregations and also perform other related financial responsibilities, such as sending year-end giving statements and informing the congregation of financial needs. Sometimes, This function is split between two officers, which is not a bad idea. Separating the incoming from the outgoing monies of a congregation is a good practice to ensure the proper use and oversight of church funds. If this is the case, then another officer, such as a financial secretary, can oversee the donations to the church, while the treasurer oversees the expenditures. And lastly, there is a secretary or clerk to keep record or minutes of the church's meetings. This is usually not a highly coveted position, as it includes some work, but it is undoubtedly highly important. Maintaining accurate minutes is invaluable in referring to past decisions of a board or congregation. Churches may need to look to past minutes to find or verify what decisions had been made by the congregation months or years prior. In addition to being a useful aid in the life of a congregation, minutes are also required by law to record when and by whom decisions were made. This is necessary for legal purposes in any event where a church's decisions or actions may be in question. And in addition, secretaries help with refining precise wording of motions, of helping with voting, and of communicating with the board and the congregation at large. These officers of the congregation are typically chosen by the board on account of their skills, their experience, and their commitment to the church. And a healthy, capable set of ministers is a huge advantage to the life of any congregation. While a board usually has wide oversight of the activities of a congregation, the business of a church may be more or much more than a board can manage alone. For this reason, many churches also establish committees, groups, or teams to oversee particular areas under the aegis of the board. Committees are frequently established by a church's bylaws, and in such cases, their composition and duties are described therein. Committee members are typically appointed by the board and are generally made up of a mix of board members, church members, and ministers. These committees operate much like a small board, being given authority over certain areas such as worship, education, or visitation, and they typically report back to or advise the board in larger decisions. Some committees are common to nearly all congregations. Most congregations, for instance, have an executive committee. This consists of the officers and the ministers of the congregation and is usually advisory for sensitive matters or to discuss proposals before bringing them to the board or the church at large. While not usually having powers unless so designated, and while usually not meeting regularly, it can be an advantage to have a group of church leaders available to consider possibilities as a smaller group. Also, nearly all churches have a nominating committee. This group, though small, is perhaps the most powerful and influential committee in a congregation, and its members should be chosen with great deliberation. The nominating committee is responsible for identifying and recruiting future members of the board, and sometimes for officers as well. While often overlooked, this group has great influence over the life of the congregation, and the task of encouraging good people for church leadership should not be taken lightly. Churches also typically have a finance committee to, at the minimum, prepare a proposed budget for the coming year. They also generally assist the treasurer in reports, letters, and other business pertaining to the finances of the church. And they may also take up some work relating to stewardship or fundraising as needed. And finally, all churches have an audit committee. While most churches have their finances overseen and reviewed by a professional accountant, the audit committee is a group of appointed members of the congregation to review a church's finances of the past year and ensure that its financial business is conducted in good order. In addition to these standard committees, churches can also have a wide range of additional committees to oversee the work of other areas of a church's life. There can be a committee on worship, education, evangelism, fellowship, Sunday school. The list goes on and on. Depending on the size and activity of a congregation, establishing teams or committees to oversee these many various areas can be a great help in tending to the many decisions and tasks that arise in the everyday operations of a congregation. And lastly, the third portion of a congregation is its ministers. Usually prepared in Bible school or seminary and licensed or ordained by a denominational body, ministers are chosen for specific tasks within the congregation, usually pertaining to leading worship, preaching, presiding at the sacraments, counseling, and other ministerial duties. Ministers come in a variety of roles. Pastors of different types, deacons focused on preaching and service, evangelists, priests, licensed preachers, and so forth. But they all have in common religious training and a call to serve a specific ministry within the church. They arrive at congregations in various ways, depending on the denomination. In some Episcopal pieties, ministers are appointed by a bishop. In Congregationalist polities, ministers are chosen by the congregation. Most are chosen in cooperation between a congregation and a bishop, and the minister, of course. And congregations usually have input in calling a minister to serve among them. Now, the range of responsibilities of ministers within churches can vary quite a bit, and bylaws should be consulted to clarify the roles in individual congregations. This is especially important if ministers and congregations have different expectations on the responsibilities of a minister. And having these responsibilities in writing and understood by both parties can help prevent a lot of frustration and disappointment. The leadership role of ministers in churches also varies widely congregation by congregation. In some churches, ministers are largely advisory while fulfilling their ministerial duties. In others, they have wide leadership authority over the operations of the church. In some polities, ministers are the de facto president of the congregation, and in others, they are not even members. And even within the same denomination, the practices and histories of congregations can vary so widely that ministers may serve very different roles in different congregations, even while holding the same title. But in all cases, the bylaws should spell out the duties, rights, and processes pertaining to ministers, how they are called or can be removed, whether they are ex officio members of boards or committees in the congregation, and familiarizing oneself with the stated role detailed in the bylaws will be advantageous for clarifying the role of ministers in varied congregations. And in all cases, the ministers, the church leaders, and the church membership work together for the same purpose, and having a clear appreciation of the function, rights, and responsibilities of these various groups, and how they effectively relate to one another, engenders a happy functioning of the church and a successful pursuit of its ministries as the body of Christ. And so thank you for joining along in this video on church structure, and may God bless you today.